the Althari revered silence above all else. Their world, Aldrinus, was a haven of stillness. Its mirrored seas whispered only faint ripples. Its endless twilight cast a gentle, constant glow. Among the Althari, communication occurred without sound. A glance, a subtle shift of the membranous crest, or a hand gesture sufficed to convey meaning. Their society had grown around this sacred quietude, and for generations they believed it to be the ultimate form of understanding. Words were considered unnecessary clutter. Then came the humans. The first emissary to the Althari assembly was a man named Kieran Doyle, a diplomatic envoy from Terra. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with sharp features and a wry, easy smile, he was a stark contrast to the serene Althari. His voice was deep and resonant, and he had an unfortunate tendency to laugh, often at the most inopportune moments. The arrival of Kieran was unsettling. The assembly had been warned that humans were noisy, but hearing him was something else entirely. During his introduction ceremony, Kieran's laughter rang out more than once. It was jarring, even for the most patient members of the assembly. Many shifted uncomfortably, their crests quivering in unison. But not Yale. A younger member of the assembly, Yale was different from her more stoic peers. She had spent her short tenure studying the Althari's ancient histories, and her empathy was stronger than most. While the others avoided Kieran's gaze, she found herself drawn to him, trying to make sense of his persistent laughter. She wondered, how could one be so unguarded, so at ease, even surrounded by alien stares? Kieran, meanwhile, was well aware of his predicament. "All right," he began, clearing his throat after another ill-timed chuckle. "Maybe not the best first impression, but I promise I'll keep the laughing to a minimum." The assembly remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Kieran turned to Yale, the only one who hadn't looked away. "How do you say thank you in your language?" he asked, a grin tugging at his lips. Yale hesitated, then raised her hand and tilted it slightly downward. Kieran mirrored the gesture, his attempt a little too quick and a touch awkward. Yale's crest rippled faintly, not quite a laugh, but close. It was enough to draw a few glances from the other assembly members. After the formalities, Kieran was assigned to Yale as his liaison. The assembly felt her studies and empathic nature made her the best candidate. It was a daunting task, one she accepted without complaint. The human would need guidance, and she was determined to understand him as much as he hoped to understand her people. "Kieran," Yale began, leading him through the grand, transparent halls of the assembly complex. The material underfoot absorbed the sound of their footsteps, rendering them almost silent. "Your vocalizations are very different from anything we have experienced." "I figured," Kieran said, his voice low but warm. "We humans talk a lot. Too much, some might say." "We do not speak at all," she said, her tone measured. "Yet we communicate just as effectively." "I'm not sure I could manage that," Kieran admitted. "Silence feels heavy. Don't you ever feel the need to just let something out?" Yale stopped in her tracks, turning to face him. Her gaze was sharp but not unkind. "What do you mean by let something out?" "You know, like venting frustration. Expressing joy. Sometimes it feels like if I don't say or do something, I'll burst." She studied him for a moment, her crest still. "No, we do not experience this." Kieran smiled again, softer this time. "I think that's something I'll never quite understand." In the days that followed, Kieran and Yale spent more time together. She guided him through the assembly's archives, showing him records of Althari history, their traditions, and their art, silent art that conveyed emotion through shape and color rather than sound. Kieran, in turn, shared stories of humanity's early struggles in space, the triumphs and failures that defined his species. He described the sounds of Terran cities, the music that carried through the air, the laughter of friends and family. Yale listened, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "What's so funny?" Yale asked one day, catching Kieran smiling to himself. "Just remembering something my brother said once," he replied. "He has this ridiculous sense of humor. Makes me laugh even when I don't want to." "Your brother's humor can force you to laugh?" "Not force," Kieran clarified. "It's more that, it's contagious. One of those things you can't help but join in on." Yale tilted her head slightly, a gesture of curiosity. "I have never experienced that." Kieran raised a brow. "Never?" "Not even once. Not in the way you describe." Yale paused, then added, "Perhaps that is why your laughter seems so strange to us." "Strange, huh?" Kieran leaned back against a smooth, translucent wall. "You make it sound like it's some kind of disease." Yale's crest shifted in what might have been amusement. "Not a disease. Simply foreign." As the days turned into weeks, their conversations grew more frequent. They started to understand each other better, not just their words, but the subtleties in their expressions and gestures. Kieran learned to recognize when Yale's crest showed curiosity, frustration, or something close to amusement. Yale, in turn, began to anticipate the moments when Kieran's laugh would bubble up and she no longer flinched when it did. One evening, after a long day of exchanging knowledge, Kieran and Yale sat by a reflective pool within the Assembly's gardens. The stillness of the scene was broken only by the soft ripples of water as Kieran trailed a hand across the surface. "You really don't ever laugh, do you?" Kieran asked, breaking the silence. Yale glanced at him, her head tilted slightly. "We do not. Do you even smile?" Yale considered the question. "Not in the way you do. Our emotions are expressed differently." Kieran nodded slowly. "You know, for all the differences between us, I feel like we're starting to understand each other." "Perhaps," Yale said, her voice as calm and measured as ever. "Though you are still quite loud." Kieran laughed, a quiet, low chuckle this time. "I'll take that as progress." Yale didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering just above Kieran's. It was a tentative motion, one that caught him off guard. Slowly, he turned his palm upward, allowing her hand to rest against his. Her skin was cool and smooth, and he felt her fingers curl slightly around his. It was the first time they truly touched. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't the solemn, sacred quiet of Aldrinus, but something different, a shared stillness that neither of them felt the need to break. When Yale finally withdrew her hand, she gave him a long, searching look. "Kieran," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Perhaps I am beginning to understand your laughter. Just a little." "Yale," Kieran said, leaning against one of the transparent pillars of the Assembly's grand archive hall. "Do you ever get bored of the quiet? I mean, it's peaceful, sure, but don't you ever wish for something more?" Yale turned to him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "We do not see silence as a void, Kieran. It is full. It allows for clarity." Kieran nodded slowly, pushing off the pillar. "I guess I can understand that. I just don't know if I could live without sound. It's like, without music, laughter, or even the hum of a city, something feels missing." "You humans rely heavily on auditory input," Yale said, her voice calm. "But we have learned to experience depth without it. The colors, the light, the vibrations, these are our forms of richness." Kieran chuckled, though he kept it quiet this time. "Okay, I get that. But what about when you're, I don't know, happy? Don't you ever want to just shout out loud or sing?" Yale's crest shifted slightly, a movement Kieran was beginning to recognize as her version of mild amusement. Why would one shout or sing when contentment can be expressed through a simple gesture or a serene presence? "Fair point," Kieran admitted. "But maybe I could show you what I mean. Can you play an instrument?" Yale tilted her head. "Our music is visual, not auditory. Patterns of light, shifting colors." "That's actually kind of beautiful," Kieran said. "Still, I bet you'd enjoy a bit of Terran music. Come on, let me show you something." He led her through the archives to a small chamber where the human's envoy had set up a workspace. It was a modest room with a few basic furnishings and a couple of Terran artifacts scattered about. From a sleek travel case, Kieran retrieved a compact device, an old-fashioned harmonica. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a harmonica. Not exactly high-tech, but it gets the job done." Yale stepped closer, studying the small metallic instrument. "What does it do?" "It makes sound," Kieran replied with a grin. "Here, listen." He brought it to his lips and began to play a simple melody, soft, slow, and surprisingly gentle. The notes rose and fell in a mournful yet soothing tune. Yale's eyes widened slightly, her crest quivering in a way Kieran hadn't seen before. When he stopped, the silence returned, but it felt different, warmer, somehow. "That was—" Yale hesitated. "Not unpleasant." "Not unpleasant, huh?" Kieran laughed. "I'll take it." "It is strange," she said, her gaze distant. "Your sounds seem to carry emotion. It is something we do not experience in this way." "That's what music is," Kieran said. "It's all about emotion. Sometimes it's joyful, sometimes sad, sometimes just calming." Yale's gaze lingered on the harmonica. "You create these sounds yourself? They are not natural." "Well, no," Kieran admitted. "It's a human thing. We invent instruments, write songs, perform them. It's a way of sharing our feelings." "Your feelings must be quite chaotic if you need such complexity to express them," Yale said, but her tone was more thoughtful than critical. Kieran chuckled again. "You have no idea." Over the next few days, their discussions turned more personal. Kieran spoke about his family. His younger brother who loved bad jokes, his mother who sang while cooking, and his father who played the piano. He described their bustling, noisy household, the way laughter and arguments could erupt at the drop of a hat. Yale listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed her growing curiosity about human life. "What is a birthday celebration?" she asked one evening as they walked along a narrow path overlooking Aldrinus's endless mirror lakes. "It's when we mark the day someone was born," Kieran explained. "It's not just about the actual date. It's an excuse to come together, eat good food, give gifts, and just celebrate the person." "You celebrate a single day out of an entire year?" Yale asked. "Exactly," Kieran said. "It's a reminder to appreciate someone, to make them feel special." Yale nodded slowly, her crest fluttering faintly. "Interesting. We do not have such traditions. Our bonds are shown through consistency, through actions repeated over time." "Well, maybe you could give it a try," Kieran suggested, half joking. "I'd be happy to throw you a party." Yale tilted her head, a gesture he had come to interpret as something akin to curiosity or amusement. "I will consider it." Their rapport grew, their conversations delving into topics both profound and mundane. Yale shared stories of Althari artists who painted with light and color, creating silent masterpieces that could evoke intense emotion without a single sound. She explained how her people's relationships were built on unspoken understanding, on the subtle shifts of expression and movement that conveyed more than words ever could. Kieran, in turn, introduced her to Terran literature. He read passages from ancient human texts, recited poetry, and described plays performed before massive, roaring crowds. Yale found the concept of applause of humans clapping their hands together to show approval fascinating and slightly baffling. "And they just hit their hands together? Why not simply nod or raise a hand?" she asked, her crest rippling with genuine curiosity. Kieran grinned. "It's not just about approval. It's about energy. The sound of 1,000 people clapping, cheering, it creates a feeling, a connection. You can feel it in the air. It's electric." Yale considered this for a long moment. "Electric," she repeated. "That is a peculiar way to describe a feeling." "Peculiar, maybe," Kieran said, "but it's the only word that fits." As the days turned to weeks, they began to work more closely. Yale guided Kieran through the Althari archives, helping him uncover texts and visual records that few humans had ever seen. Together, they pored over ancient Althari designs, analyzing their elegant structures and silent art forms. Kieran contributed his engineering expertise, offering insights into how Terran technology might complement Althari techniques. One afternoon, as they examined a particularly intricate light sculpture, Kieran leaned in to get a closer look. Yale did the same, their faces only inches apart. "You see this pattern here?" Kieran said, pointing to a swirling, crystalline structure within the sculpture. "It reminds me of something called fractals. They're patterns that repeat at different scales, found all over nature on Earth." Yale turned her gaze to him, her expression thoughtful. "We have similar structures here, though we do not have a word for them as you do. They simply are." "Fascinating," Kieran murmured. "It's like we're looking at the same thing, but from different angles." Yale's crest shifted slightly. "Perhaps that is what this collaboration is, different perspectives finding a shared understanding." "Couldn't have said it better myself," Kieran said, meeting her eyes with a smile. Their partnership became more than a professional alliance. They began to anticipate each other's thoughts, finishing each other's sentences, and sometimes even sharing a glance that needed no words. Though Kieran still couldn't resist the occasional chuckle, Yale no longer flinched at the sound. Instead, she found herself wondering how his laughter could feel so warm, so inviting, in a world that prized silence. In those moments, she caught herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, sound wasn't the enemy her people had always believed it to be. And perhaps, in working together, they might discover a balance and understanding that would bridge the quiet spaces between their worlds. It had been weeks since Kieran Doyle first set foot on Aldrinus. The quiet had ceased to unsettle him the way it did at first. If anything, he was beginning to understand it. Maybe even appreciate it. Still, the moments he shared with Yale brought a kind of clarity that no amount of silence ever could. Each day, their conversations grew more familiar, more natural, and the initial formality of their encounters had given way to something closer to friendship. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the translucent walls of an ancient Althari temple, Kieran and Yale worked side by side, examining a collection of etched glyphs. Kieran carefully traced one of the carvings with his fingers, feeling the smooth surface beneath the ridges. Yale watched his movements closely, These symbols, Kieran said, his voice low, are older than anything we've got on Earth. I mean, we've got ruins, sure, old buildings, ancient writings, but this is something else. Yale's crest shifted slightly, the Althari equivalent of a nod. They predate our written records. Their meaning is mostly lost, but we believe they represent foundational principles of our culture. Balance, harmony, understanding. Understanding, Kieran echoed. That's something we humans still struggle with sometimes. Yale tilted her head, a gesture Kieran recognized as curiosity. Do you not value harmony among your kind? He let out a quiet laugh. Oh, we value it, all right. We're just not always good at achieving it. Sometimes, it feels like humans are more interested in proving who's right rather than working together. And yet, you are here, Yale said, her tone thoughtful. You came to our world seeking common ground. That is a form of harmony, is it not? Guess you're right, Kieran admitted. He glanced at Yale, catching the faint shimmer of light on her reflective skin. It's not always easy, though. Understanding each other takes time, effort, patience. Patience is something we have in abundance, Yale said. Though I find myself surprised by how much I've learned from you in a short time. Kieran smiled. That's because you're a good teacher. I mean, I'd be lost without you explaining what these symbols mean, how your culture works. And you have taught me much about your own, Yale replied, her crest fluttering faintly. I find your perspective enlightening. They fell into a comfortable silence as they continued their work. Yale carefully brushed away dust from a particularly ornate glyph, revealing intricate patterns beneath. Kieran leaned in closer, his shoulder brushing hers. It was a brief, unintentional touch, but it lingered in the air between them. Kieran hesitated, then glanced at Yale. Sorry, didn't mean to invade your space. Yale looked at him, her dark, reflective eyes unreadable. It is not an invasion, she said softly. Merely a moment of contact. Does that bother you? He asked, his tone cautious. No, she replied after a pause. It does not. Kieran nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment before returning to the glyphs. The quiet resumed, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of quiet that allowed thought to settle, that made even the smallest sound, a soft breath, the gentle scrape of a tool, feel significant. As the day stretched into evening, they took a break. They sat on a low bench outside the temple, the mirrored surface of a nearby lake reflecting the sky's dusky hues. Kieran pulled out his harmonica, turning it over in his hands. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Kieran asked, glancing at Yale. If humans and Althari had never met? Yale considered his question. It is difficult to imagine a world where our paths did not cross. Meeting you has already changed how I see certain aspects of our way of life. Yeah, Kieran said, raising the harmonica to his lips. Same here. He played a soft, meandering tune, the notes carrying across the still water. Yale watched him intently, her crest shifting in time with the melody's rises and falls. When he finished, she tilted her head slightly. That sound, she said, it conveys more than just noise. It carries emotion. It stirs something within. That's music for you, Kieran replied with a grin. It's a universal language, they say. Universal, Yale repeated. Perhaps that is true. Even though we do not create sound as you do, I find it beautiful. Kieran set the harmonica down and leaned back, resting his hands on the bench behind him. You know, Yale, I think you'd make a great musician. You've got an ear for it. She tilted her head again, a small quirk of her lips hinting at a smile. I am not certain your harmonica would sound the same in my hands. Only one way to find out, Kieran said, holding it out to her. Yale hesitated before reaching for it. Her long, slender fingers brushed against his as she took it. It's weird at first. Yale brought the harmonica to her lips and tried. The first sound was a shaky, uncertain note, but she adjusted, her movements growing more deliberate. Soon, a clear tone emerged. A single, sustained note that hung in the air like a thread of light. Kieran clapped his hands once. That's it. You're a natural. Yale lowered the harmonica, looking at him with something close to surprise. I did not expect to produce such a sound. You're better at it than I was the first time, he said. It took me a week just to get one note out. Perhaps I have a gift, Yale said, her crest fluttering faintly. Kieran laughed softly. Yeah, maybe you do. As they sat there, passing the harmonica back and forth, the gap between them seemed to shrink. Each note Yale played, each word they exchanged, felt like another step toward something deeper. And though the night around them remained quiet, it was a quiet filled with the echoes of shared understanding and the first notes of something entirely new. The days were shorter now, Aldrinus tilting into its long dusk season. A faint violet hue painted the horizon, deepening the soft light that filtered through the assembly's floating cities. Kieran found the change comforting. Something about the dim, even glow made the world feel quieter, as if the planet itself was preparing to rest. Yale joined him that evening, her presence signaled by a subtle rustle of fabric. She moved almost silently, a quality Kieran had come to admire. I found the glyph you were asking about, she said, holding a delicate crystal tablet in her hands. It's rare for us to study these at such depth. Most Althari take their meaning as a given. Thanks, Kieran said, reaching out to accept the tablet. Their hands brushed briefly, and the cool, smooth texture of Yale's skin sent a faint shiver up his arm. You know, you've been an amazing guide through all this. I couldn't have made sense of any of it on my own. I have learned much from your questions, Yale replied. They make me consider things I once overlooked. He smiled. Guess that makes us a pretty good team, huh? Yale tilted her head slightly, the light catching her reflective skin. A team. Yes, I would agree. Kieran placed the tablet on the table beside them, letting his hand linger for a moment. So, what does this one mean exactly? This glyph, Yale explained, tracing her fingers lightly over the surface, is believed to represent the concept of shared existence. It is not just about two beings occupying the same space, but about their lives intertwining in ways that enrich both. Sounds kind of like a partnership, Kieran said. Partnership, Yale echoed. Yeah, like two people working together, learning from each other, growing together. It's not always smooth, but it's worth it in the end. Yale considered his words. We do not have an exact word for this in our language. We would simply say the two have found balance. Balance, Kieran repeated. I like that. Makes it sound like it's something you work toward, not something you just have. She nodded. It requires effort, understanding, patience, and a little laughter, he added with a smirk. Yale's crest rippled faintly, a movement Kieran now recognized as her version of a smile. Perhaps. The evening passed quietly as they worked side by side. Kieran asked questions about the glyphs, occasionally jotting down notes, while Yale patiently explained their meanings. Every so often he would make a lighthearted comment, earning that faint ripple of amusement from Yale. At one point, Kieran leaned back, stretching his arms above his head. You know, I think I'm finally getting the hang of the silence thing. Yale raised an eyebrow, her crest tilting slightly. You still speak more than most Althari would in a day. Okay, fair point, he said, laughing quietly. But at least I'm not trying to fill every second with noise anymore. That is progress, Yale said. Kieran looked at her, his expression turning thoughtful. It's funny. Back on Earth, I'd never have imagined myself spending so much time in silence. But here, with you, it feels natural. Yale met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the room. I have also found our conversations to be enjoyable. He smiled, his voice soft. Yeah, me too. The air between them shifted, a subtle change that both of them felt. They were sitting closer now, their hands almost touching on the table. Kieran reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Yale's. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, allowing her palm to meet his. It was a quiet gesture, but it spoke volumes. Kieran looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. Yale. She tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. I never thought I'd feel this connected to someone from another world, he said, his voice low. You've helped me see things differently about myself, about what it means to really understand another person. You have helped me as well, Yale replied. I have learned that not all sound disrupts. Some of it brings warmth. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. You're something else, you know that? She inclined her head, her crest fluttering faintly. I believe that applies to you as well. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was rich, full of unspoken understanding. Their connection had grown quietly, steadily, like a melody played so softly that you had to lean in to hear it. In that moment, they didn't need words. They simply sat together, hands intertwined as Aldrinus's long dusk deepened around them. The Aldrinus sky stretched vast and violet, its mirrored seas shimmering as though the entire planet breathed in unison. Kirin and Yale stood near the edge of a long, curved platform overlooking the water. The soft hum of the city's energy fields whispered beneath them, a sound so faint that Kirin had barely noticed it when he'd first arrived. Now it felt almost like an old friend. "This view never gets old," Kirin said, leaning on the railing. "Your world has a way of making you feel small. In a good way." Yale, standing beside him, tilted her head. "Do you not experience such moments on Terra?" "We have our quiet places," Kirin replied, "but they're getting harder to find. Cities are noisy, crowded. People don't stop to listen anymore. Here it's different. The quiet is everywhere." Yale's crest shifted slightly, a motion Kirin recognized as agreement. "Your kind must value silence more than you realize then." "Maybe," Kirin said, "but it's not just the silence. It's how you all live, the way you connect without words. There's a calmness to it that's hard to explain. Yet you bring sound with you," Yale observed. "Your voice, your laughter, your music." "Guilty," Kirin said with a grin. "But I think we've found a good balance, don't you?" Yale glanced at him, her dark, reflective eyes holding his gaze. "Balance is important. It is what allows us to learn from one another." "Exactly," Kirin said. "We've learned a lot from each other. I never thought I'd come to a place where silence could be so meaningful. And I never thought someone like you would teach me how to listen." "You listen well now," Yale said. "Better than many of my own people." "High praise coming from you," Kirin said, a teasing note in his voice. "It is the truth," Yale replied, her tone steady. "You have changed since you arrived here. Your voice is softer. Your words carry more thought." "Maybe you've rubbed off on me," Kirin said, smiling. Yale's crest fluttered faintly, a gesture Kirin had learned to recognize as her version of a smile. "Perhaps you have also influenced me. I now find myself looking forward to your laughter." "Yeah?" Kirin asked, his smile widening. "What about my music?" "It is intriguing," Yale admitted, "though I still do not fully understand it." "Well, I'll take that as a compliment," Kirin said, chuckling. He pulled the harmonica from his pocket, holding it up so Yale could see. "Wanna give it another go?" Yale hesitated, then nodded. She reached for the small instrument, her long, slender fingers brushing against Kirin's as she took it. This time she seemed more confident. She placed the harmonica to her lips and tried a single note. It was soft, hesitant but clear. "Nice," Kirin said encouragingly. "Now try moving it side to side. Don't worry if it sounds rough at first." Yale followed his instruction, producing a series of wavering tones. They weren't quite a melody, but they carried a tentative beauty. She stopped after a few moments, lowering the harmonica and looking at Kirin. "It is not as simple as it seems," she said. "Doesn't have to be perfect," Kirin said. "It's about experimenting, finding a sound you like. Here, let me show you something." He took the harmonica and played a slow, gentle tune, something he'd improvised in his head the first time he saw Aldrinus's vast seas. The notes drifted out, mingling with the faint hum of the city. Yale watched him intently. "You create these melodies without prior knowledge of them?" "Yep," Kirin said. "I just play what feels right." "That is not how we create," Yale said. "Our art is planned, deliberate. Each pattern of light, each shift of color follows a predetermined design." "Maybe that's why this feels different to you," Kirin said. "It's spontaneous. It changes depending on the moment." Yale's crest moved in a thoughtful ripple. "Perhaps that is why it is interesting. It reflects your emotions in real time." "Exactly," Kirin said. "It's like a conversation, but with sound." "A conversation without words," Yale said softly. Kirin nodded. "Yeah, and sometimes that's all you need." They stood in silence for a while, watching the fading light on the water. Kirin played a few more notes, letting the harmonica's sound blend with the quiet. Yale listened, her gaze focused on the horizon. "You've changed the way I think about silence," Kirin said eventually. "And you have changed the way I think about sound," Yale replied. Their eyes met, and for a moment everything else faded away. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was full of understanding, connection, and a shared sense of discovery. Kieran reached out and Yale did the same, their fingers meeting in a light, deliberate touch. It was a simple gesture, but it carried all the meaning they needed.